Since the advent of nuclear weapons, there became the need to create shelters that would protect a segment of the population as a way for humanity to continue. In 1954, the U.S. government started Operation Alert, an annual exercise that was meant to prepare the public for thermonuclear war. It would take place over an extended period each year that would culminate in an event that simulated a nuclear attack. By 1956, Operation Alert was taking place in 75 cities across the U.S., locations that were considered to be prime targets of nuclear bombs. If you didn't participate, you were arrested and fined upwards of $500, which is about $5,000 today. There were numerous protests pushing back against this governmental overreach. Each year, the protests grew larger until finally they stopped Operation Alert in 1961. During this time, the government wasn't just building shelters. They were making their own fully functional underground bases. The biggest and probably best known one was the massive bunker built in the Cheyenne Mountain Complex for NORAD. Most people know it as the one featured prominently in the 1983 film War Games. The base was envisioned in the late 50s, started construction in 1961, and was finished and fully operational in 1967. The complex was built in an excavated mountain under 2,000 feet of granite. Each of the 15 three-story buildings within the bunker are protected from movement by a system of enormous springs that act as shock absorbers to protect against everything from earthquakes to nuclear explosions. The buildings are filled with work areas, living quarters, hospitals, restaurants, gyms, and so on. It is a fully functional underground city. The two entrances to the area are through gigantic 25-ton blast doors. The location was one of the main hubs for the government in the case of nuclear war, but there were others built in major cities where residents could take shelter. Some people built their own, and some companies started to provide pre-built shelters you could bury in your backyard. As time progressed, it became clear the entire population couldn't move underground. There were discussions on how civilization would continue and how to cull the best of the best as a way to have them survive to repopulate the Earth. It was discussed that they would choose a list of survivors, but it became clear that the list was overrun with nepotism instead of those that should survive. Lots of people on the list who are relatives of government officials, as opposed to scientists and doctors. They decided that the choice should come down to an impartial judge, a computer. They'd feed it raw data of the population, and it would pick the shelter occupants by the criteria of the best persons with the best chance of survival. While the first disaster movie was San Francisco in 1936, it wasn't until decades later that disaster films exploded in popularity. There was a script that was a combination of disaster movie and nuclear war that was making the rounds. It was about a group of people who were abducted in the middle of the night and transported to an underground bunker somewhere in the desert. They're sent nearly 2,000 feet underground, where they discover they're part of a government program that has targeted each of them as essential to the rebirth of humanity after nuclear war. Each one of them has skills that'll be necessary for survival, and they now have to live out their days preparing for the time when they can return to the surface. However, they discovered things are not what they seem. It turns out the world isn't coming to an end. This was all an elaborate test conducted by the government. The original script was written by Howard Kreitzek, who wrote the screenplay for The Illustrated Man and Rabbit Run. The movie was going to be distributed through Cinerama, but was later passed off to Metro Media Producers Corporation, or MPC. MPC largely handled made-for-TV content with shows like That Girl, My Favorite Martian, and The Merv Griffin Show. Disaster movies were a big trend, so MPC was funding their own made-for-TV versions like Hurricane and Terror on the 40th Floor. They also delved into apocalyptic movies with Where Have All the People Gone? They hired a new writer, Harry Spalding, who used the pseudonym H.B. Cross. He had previously written movies like The Day Mars Invaded Earth, Surf Party, and The Earth Dies Screaming. Since MPC was mostly a TV production outfit, they hired a TV director. They brought in Sutton Roley to direct the picture. Roley's previous credits included Combat, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and Lost in Space. At this point, he had only directed one theatrical movie, The Loners in 1972. They cast the movie with actors that did do movies, but they were largely known for their TV work. Jackie Cooper, Alex Cord, Richard Jekyll, Bradford Dillman, Lincoln Kilpatrick, Pedro Armendariz Jr., Diana Muldaur, Gwen Mitchell, and Barbara Babcock. For the video announcements the group would receive, They hired TV personality Kelly Lang, an anchorwoman who was on NBC and CBS. While working on the production, someone involved had an idea. The initial concept for the film was to revolve around these people struggling to find cohesion in their group and survive this new life they've been thrust into. What if we did that, but then added hundreds of killer vampire bats? This changed the dynamic of the movie from a tense thriller about the horrors of war and how a group of people would struggle to survive as the last remnants of humanity into more of a humans versus monsters horror film. Barbara Babcock had previously worked with director Sutton Roley on a few TV shows, and he personally selected her for the movie. She was less than enthusiastic about the changes. She said, "The script was really interesting when I first got it. What ended up making it a Z-grade horror film was the insertion of vampire bats." The cast in general wasn't too pleased with the changes, but having already signed on, they forged ahead with the picture. The writers had done an incredible amount of research on the subject of bomb shelter survival, and much of that drama was thrown out the window to make room for more bat sequences. The studio was looking into shooting the film in the US, but with the addition of the bats, they had to look elsewhere. In the US, there are rules about how animals are to be treated on film. There were no such rules in Mexico. Because of this, the studio then formed a partnership with Churubusco Studios in Mexico City, so they could shoot there without having to deal with those pesky animal protection laws. They hired animal wranglers to go to various caves and capture the thousands of bats they'd need for the film. They had to catch and release them every day, since if they kept the bats around longer than that, they died. Every dusk, they put nets over various caves in Mexico City to capture as many as they could, so they could use them the next day. As a way to make filming easier, they planned on filming with no barriers in between the bats and the humans. They insisted everyone get rabies shots to protect themselves. Cooper and Babcock refused. It was a combination of the fact that they didn't want to get the shots, but also because they didn't want to work in areas unprotected from thousands of bats. Not wanting a lawsuit, the producers had them set up invisible screens that they could film through while the cast was protected. Since they could no longer film the cast with the bats, they shot footage of the bats on a green screen, which they composited onto shots of the cast flailing around. While many of the bats were real, they also had some that were puppets. The puppeteer was Tony Urbano, who later would go on to do the puppet work for Men in Black 1 and 2 and Team America World Police. When filming, Diana Muldaur had a severe allergic reaction to her rabies shot. She became extremely lethargic, and the arm where she received the shot swelled up like a balloon. The doctor stated that she needed bed rest, which is why she disappears for part of the film, and they changed her scenes so she was in bed and you couldn't see her swollen arm. One day while filming, a bat got through the barricade and climbed up Babcock's leg. The director saw this and kept filming, wanting to get the best reaction out of the actress. She panicked and yelled, "Cut!" since she didn't have her shots, and didn't want to risk the bat freaking out and biting her. Before the release, they changed the name from Bats to Chosen Survivors. The movie opened in the spring of 1974. The studio was unsure of how to market the film, which may have confused audiences. They tried to sell it as both a disaster film, but also an apocalyptic drama, which, in essence, it is a bit of both of those. It was largely trashed by critics. Ed Naha, the writer of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, said, "Even Bela Lugosi would have walked out on this one." It stayed in theaters for years, often appearing on a double bill with movies like Logan's Run. However, it was buried by much bigger disaster movies released that year, like Earthquake and The Towering Inferno. After the production, there was a lawsuit brought up to change the law about animal cruelty in American productions filmed outside the U.S. Barbara Babcock and Jackie Cooper both spoke to the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences and testified in court, which brought about a massive change in the industry. Now there's a law that any American picture company filming abroad must follow the American rules and regulations so that animals are to be treated humanely and not killed. So as awful as things were, at least some good came from this. Chosen Survivors is an interesting film that's marred by its jump from serious claustrophobic survival film to monster movie. It's not ruined by the addition of bats, but the original concept could have potentially yielded a much better film. The idea of having all these different personalities clashing in this fortified bunker while trying to come to grips with the fact that the world is ending would have made for a very tense dramatic thriller. I don't hate the inclusion of the bats, but it makes the movie about the group trying to escape the shelter rather than trying to survive in it. Even though this was a theatrically released film, it still has the feel of a made-for-TV movie. The themes and language were too strong for TV, but the flat shots make it look like an expensive soap opera. Some of the process shots are bad. Really bad. I can understand why they had to do them for the bats, but the ones showcasing the destruction outside were terrible, even for the time. They would have been better just cutting them and showing the raw data of the destruction in its place. It would have delivered the same message, and wouldn't have pulled the audience out of the picture with an awful effect. I don't know why the bats looked so bad. They did process shots for Hitchcock's The Birds, which looked much better despite being done 10 years earlier. Chosen Survivors is a different sort of post-apocalyptic film. I usually go for the more absurd, over-the-top ones like 1990 Bronx Warriors, but I'm always open to an alternative take on my favorite theme. I liked how sterile they made the shelter, which made the look of it covered in blood stand out even more. Sutton Roley never made another theatrical movie, but he did return to TV, where he did movies like Satan's Triangle, and shows like Airwolf, and Shades of L.A. The art director for the film was Jose Rodriguez Granada, who followed this up with The Devil's Reign, and later, Total Recall. I do wonder what the movie would have been like with a different director. It's possible they might have stayed with the original concept, because while it's not 100% known, it's largely speculated that the director was the one who added in the bats. I like the movie for what it is, and I also lament it for what it isn't. The movie's similar to another movie released the same year, the Spanish film Creation of the Damned, which was about two married couples surviving in a bomb shelter after a nuclear war. It also shares some themes with the 1976 film The People Who Own the Dark. More recently was The Divide from 2011 and The Hidden from 2015. Although The Hidden was a family in a bomb shelter after a plague outbreak, it still has the claustrophobia and survival aspects. There have been other movies with this theme, but almost all of them end up including something else to ratchet up the tension, as if complete nuclear devastation just isn't enough.